It was a short, one paragraph item in the morning edition. A friend rang me up and read it to me. Nothing special, something a rookie reporter fresh out of college might have written for practice. The date, a street corner, a person driving a truck, a pedestrian, a casualty, an investigation of possible negligence. Sounded like one of those poems on the inner flap of a magazine. Where's the funeral? I asked. You got me, he said. Did she even have family? Of course she had a family. I called the police department to track down her family's address and telephone number, after which I gave them a call to get details of the funeral. Her family lived in an old quarter of Tokyo. I got out my map and marked the block in red. There were subway and train and bus lines everywhere, overlapping like some misshapen spider web, the whole area a maze of narrow streets and drainage canals. The day of the funeral, I took a streetcar from Wasada. I got off near the end of the line. The map proved about as helpful as a globe would have been. I ended up buying pack after pack of cigarettes, asking directions each time. It was a wood frame house with a brown board fence around it. A small yard with an abandoned ceramic brazier filled with standing rainwater. The ground was dark and damp. She'd left home when she was 16, which may have been the reason why the funeral was so sombre. Only family present, nearly everyone older. It was presided over by her older brother, barely 30, and maybe it was her brother-in-law. Her father, a shortish man in his mid-50s, wore a black armband of mourning. He stood by the entrance and scarcely moved. Reminded me of a street washed clean after a downpour. On leaving, I lowered my head in silence, and he lowered his head in return without a word. I met her in autumn 9 years ago, when I was 20 and she was 17. There was a small coffee shop near the university where I hung out with friends. It wasn't much of anything, but it offered a certain constant: hard rock and bad coffee. She'd always be sitting in the same spot, elbows planted on the table, reading. With her glasses, which resembled orthodontia, and skinny hands, she seemed somehow endearing. Always her coffee would be cold, always her ashtrays full of cigarette butts. The only thing that changed was the book. One time it'd be Mickey Spillane, another time Kenzaburo Oi, another time Allen Ginsberg. Didn't matter what it was, as long as it was a book. The students who drifted in and out of the place would lend her books, and she'd read them clean through, cover to cover, devour them like so many ears of corn. In those days, people lent out books as a matter of course, so she never wanted for anything to read. Those were the days of the Doors, the Stones, the Birds, Deep Purple and the Moody Blues. The air was alive, even as everything seemed poised on the verge of collapse, waiting for a push. In today's session, I'd like to talk a little bit about the use of time as a narrative method. And in my last video, we looked a little bit about the narrative voice and the sense of the reliable, the unreliable narrator. The narrator is homodiegetic, so featuring as a character in the story. The questions that we may ask of the narrative, or the questions that may arise as part of the narrative, and the ways in which narrative voice is created. And we're going to go through some similar processes today to consider time as a narrative tool. So the first thing we want to do is make the distinction. When we talk about time, we're talking about two different types of time. The first, and the simplest to wrap our head around, is the notion of plot time. The story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that is a straight line, a straight chronological sequence of things that happen. And the important thing to think about here is that's how time works. It moves forward. Narrative time is the order in which we learn something. So that could be a squiggly line, that could be a load of circles. So if you imagine a beginning, a middle, and an end, I take my parrot for a walk, my parrot flies away, I'm stood in the street crying. That's the story, a chronological sequence of events. Narrative could start with me crying in the street, then a flashback to me walking down the street with my parrot. I don't want to say my dog because I don't want to jinx it. My dog's already flighty enough as it is. And then the moment my parrot is lost. And that's how it works. So plot time, straight line. Narrative time, woohoo, all over the shop. So that's the first important thing to have a think about. The order in which you learn the events is not the same as the order in which they happen. They're the order in which they are recalled to us. And this becomes particularly significant with the first person narrative. Because when we have a person who is a character in the story retelling us the events of that story, then we start to think about some really interesting aspects of narrative: recollection, memory, omission, the obscuring of something, the limitations of a first person narrative, because we're not privy to other things that are happening if we can only see what that character has been able to see. So when we think about our first prose text in year 12, which is Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, it's absolutely reliant on memory and making connections between the past and the present, and perhaps also even the possibilities of the future. So one of the things that I want to start off with then, before we have a closer look at the extract excuse me, that I've just read to you, is just to have a look at some what we would call AO2. And that's when we talk about the technical vocabulary that we would see. So what you have in front of you, I had to close my eyes to count them then, is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different terms to describe what's happening with time. And hopefully this is a good moment that you might, screenshot, pause, scribble down some things here. There shouldn't be anything that is starkly terrifying to you. I'll have a really quick run through. Chronologically, sequence, beginning, middle, end. A framed narrative is when we have a story within a story. So a really good example of this is if you've ever read or studied Frankenstein, you'll know that Frankenstein narrates the story, but he narrates it to Captain Walton. And it's actually Captain Walton's voice that we hear first within the novel. The use of flashbacks, a cyclical structure. Does the story end up where it started? Shifts in time and place, the use of multiple narrators, which is always quite an exciting thing to do. Foreshadowing, where you might have an event or a symbol or a motif that then is repeated or kind of called back to later on. Analepsis and prolepsis just mean flash forwards and flashbacks. So analepsis means to go back and prolepsis means to flash forward. This may really confuse you, but the word lep and lepsis, lapan, is about rabbit. It's where the word for rabbit comes from. Bear with me. And so prolepsis, I always think of a little rabbit jumping forward. You may make fun. I've never used that word incorrectly in my life. Okay. Streamless consciousness, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We often associate that with a sense of like a great outpouring, an emotional outpouring from a narrator, and where it fits in with time is that time becomes flexible. There is no set time frame. We don't know what the time frame is for this character thinking. Episodic, epistolary is when you might have big chunks of the story left out. If it's episodic, think about it like a TV show. You just get, here is the most important thing, then some other stuff happens, but that doesn't matter, and then here's another important thing as well. Epistolary is all about the use of documents, so diary entries, letters, newspaper reports, and so on. And then finally, how a novel is organised. So here we think about volumes, chapters, and sections. Where that last bullet point is particularly pertinent is when we have a look at Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which we have a look at the beginning of year 13, because Tess of the D'Urbervilles is written in 7 phases. And those phases are very important in terms of how they look at nature, the moon, man's journey through life, and so on. So let's have a look at it, see if we can apply some of these things just to make it a bit more tangible. So today's extract is from a book called A Wild Sheep Chase by a Japanese author called Haruki Murakami. And Murakami is particularly famous, and I'm looking at my book in front of me, particularly famous, particularly well known for doing interesting things with narrative, things to do with time, memory, someone being in the present and going back and revisiting an area, a place in the past as well. Time's very flexible and quite magical and dreamy in Murakami books. If you've never heard of Murakami, or you've heard of him but not read any of his work, then Norwegian Wood is one of his most famous books. And today's extract is from A Wild Sheep Chase So you could start in either of those places as well. So let's have a look at the extract. Now, I'm really sorry that it appears as a picture from the book, but Murakami books, A Wild Sheep Chase was written written in 82. So very much still within copyright, so I can't just find it on the internet for you. So let's just have a bit of a walk through the extract again and then start to pick out some of the different things that it does with time. And you'll see how this big heading of time as a narrative method actually is incredibly nuanced and incredibly detailed. It was a short paragraph item in the morning edition. A friend rang me up and read it to me. Nothing special, something a rookie reporter fresh out of college might have written for practice. A date, a street corner, a person driving a truck, a pedestrian, a casualty, an investigation of possible negligence. Now let's just pick up on that detail. So he's reading an obituary, and the obituary he recounts that is so cold and so sparse that he recounts it as a list. And so you have this momentous occasion of somebody's violent and we would think quite tragic death shrunk. And here time is condensed and it makes it feel so cold and so distant from the victim in the heart of this as well. So the very first thing that we look at there then is this idea of time. We don't know when it happened. We don't know the nature of the person's injuries, but it's just this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, done. A real condensing and sort of numbing of time there as well. So as we read a bit further on, I called the police department to track down her family's address and telephone number, after which I gave them a call to get the details of the funeral. Her family lived in an old quarter of Tokyo. Now, although we are writing in the past tense, although the narrator is writing in the past tense, we get a very strong sense that this is the present, if that makes sense. So it's in the past tense. I called the police department. I gave them a call. Her family lived. But this seems to be the near present to us. And one of the ways that it becomes the near present is we're going to have a flashback in a moment, in a couple of paragraphs' time. So we want to be aware that although the author is using the present tense, and think about books that you're reading at the moment, this is the near present. So this is the starting of that kind of chronological timeline here as well. If you carry on and find the phrase, the beginning of the paragraph, the day of the funeral, I took a streetcar from Wasada. I got off near the end of the line. The map proved about as helpful as a globe would have been. I ended up buying pack after pack of cigarettes, asking directions each time. Now, what's interesting here, I think, is that we have a clear sequence of events. The narrator gets off the streetcar the day of the funeral, looks at the map, unhelpful, goes a number of places buying cigarettes, asking for directions, and then finds the house. But actually, when you look closely here, time is really indistinct. And we don't get a sense that it took a long time, and we don't get a sense that it took a short time. And so what's interesting is that the mood of the narrator is really what's setting the pace here. And it feels methodical. It feels very calm. We don't feel like we're being rushed from place to place. We definitely don't get a sense of sadness or of mourning here, despite the fact that he's moving closer towards this funeral. It's recounted to us in language that's very simple in lots of ways, even with that beautiful image of describing her father like a street washed clean after a downpour. Stunning, what a stunning sentence. So we are set up in this present of the narrator going to the funeral, and then we have a flashback, and we have a distinctive paragraph break there as well, which don't underestimate those things when we have those distinct paragraph breaks. I met her in autumn 9 years ago when I was 20 and she was 17. Now, within that one sentence, look at all of those references to time. It's autumn. That could be significant for a number of different ways. It's the beginning of an academic year. So we may think of autumn being, the last sort of third of the year, but it's the beginning of the academic year. It's our spring in school terms because it's the beginning of everything. I was 20, she was 17. So we have an understanding of where their characters are at. It was 9 years ago, so nearly a decade has passed. So actually, we're dealing with loads of different timelines. The time of the year, the time that's passed, and the age that the two characters were. And you can see when we start to think about time and the use of time, there's loads. There is purposefully loads. I have chosen this extract because it does do lots of things at the time. Not all novels are like this. So we have this analepsis, the flashback. And then we have my last example is the description of the girl. So she sat in the cafe, always. Orthodontia, I assume, is that her glasses reminded him of braces. I guess that's what that means. But she's got her skinny hands, cold coffee, cigarette butts, elbows on the table, stuck in a book. And here, the use of time is that we have the narrator's observations of her, and it's all about patterns. So he doesn't specifically say, on this day she sat in that spot. She'd always, a word to do with time, she'd always be sat in the same spot. She seemed somehow endearing. Always her coffee would be cold, always her ashtray full of cigarette butts. So this idea of always, that she exists in this pattern in time. One of the things that marks a passage of time then is the list. So he says, he names the authors that she's reading, Mickey Spillane, Kenzaburo Ai, and Allen Ginsberg. So we get the sense that she's been there for a long time. Students drift in and drift out. In those days, people lent out books. So we have a sense, this placement of the character and these patterns of observations over a period of time. And so all the memories of her blend into one as well. The last thing that I'll pick out here is something I didn't mention at the beginning, and that's time, historical time. So the time of the plot, he meets a girl in a coffee shop near the university he's been at, who's always reading a book, who's clearly too young to go to the university. The present point of narrative, the future, we're a decade later, and which for us then becomes the present. But we also have mention of what decade it is. Those were the days of the Doors, the Stones, the Byrds, Deep Purple, and the Moody Blues. So although we do learn it a couple of paragraphs later, it's clearly the 60s. So that has some effect on the way in which we perceive what's happening and our understanding of students and student life in the 60s as well. So there's loads just within that opening chapter that tell us about the importance of time, and the importance for time for an author to set up and place the characters and place the reader, but also thinking about time as a way to express memory and travel as well. So you could follow this up by thinking about the novel that you're reading at the moment. You better be reading a novel at the moment, and thinking about the way in which time affects how the story is told. And a good activity would be just a really quick 5 minutes. Could you take a moment, or if you're really busy, take the plot of a book, maybe the events of a chapter, and look at the difference between the plot line and the narrative line and see how it changes as well. Happy reading.